Sometimes, I know, it's unreal, sometimes on rare occasions I share hands-on reviews on this channel. Today we're going to be covering a special one. It's a classic. The more I've gotten into this hobby, the more I've learned that tactility is like one of the #1 things. Feedback is everything. Frankly, if this was to be the last chronograph I'd ever own, I would be very happy. So, here we go. Let's first start by saying that the Omega Speedmaster is an icon. It has one of the most amazing stories behind it. The design is faultless, unless you want to dig up the Rodania geometer and open up that can of worms, but and if I had my way with it, I would remove the gonads at the 12 o'clock position. Otherwise, that's perfect. The Speedmaster is one of the most documented watches ever. In fact, I'll go so far to say it's probably the most documented chronograph ever made, where every minute aspect has been catalogued, scrutinized. Being one of the most successful watches in history, it deserves that. And the reason why I'm covering the Speedmaster first is that the Breitling 765, a direct rival, a polar opposite, well, it doesn't have anywhere near the same level of fanfare. And in fact, if you've never heard about the 765 co-pilot, I wouldn't blame you. We normally think Breitling, we think Navitimer, and then we move on. But the co-pilot, this little gem, has a story based on failure. Quite a great story. Many applications for military contracts that never worked out, and through defeat on all of these fronts, it somehow became a cult classic all on its own. So a quick side note about me and chronographs. I would never call myself a chronograph guy. It's always been about the simpler, sports-oriented, preferably with a bezel and water resistance kind of piece for me. But the one watch that kicked me into gear, that got me started down this road, what must be 5 years ago, if you've been following me that long, you'll probably know it's the Longines Avigation BigEye. Years after it was released, it was the one watch that I'd always go back to. I'd always refer to it in videos. Until one day, on a whim, I picked it up, and to this day, pound for pound, the best value for money watch I have ever bought and may ever buy. Do yourself a favor and get yourself one of these if you can. That's all I will say. The build is solid, it's got a fantastic movement, it's a field watch on steroids. There are too many things to like about this watch, but times change, tastes change. And the chief reason why I fell out with it was simply because the case thickness was a bit too much and I would feel the rotor spinning on my wrist when I was wearing the watch. It's a ridiculous thing when you think about it, such a minor little aspect. Long story short, after it left, there was a chronograph-sized hole that needed to be filled. Now, adding a Speedmaster around this time felt like a great idea because I've handled some gems in my time. I've been incredibly lucky. And I've always been infatuated with the CK2998. That's the one reference, if I ever was to own a Speedmaster, that I would go after. Always been more of a fan of the straight lugs, the alpha-styled hands, and all the many characteristics that help define this watch. Ideally, the lollipop hand variant, which I think is a -5, and those have got to be the most coveted Speedmasters in the world. They're incredibly rare and they're so special. But the option of chasing a first Omega in space was there, for a decent price too. But owning a Seamaster 300 already, I have the Omega box ticked. I needed to look elsewhere. So this led me down the Breitling rabbit hole, and as we know, Breitling as a brand, they cut their teeth on creating some of the most pioneering chronographs through the early years, especially in the aviation space. It has an amazing history worth checking out. From creating some of the earliest known wrist-worn chronographs during the First World War, to being the first maker to ever debut external pushers on a watch case. There's a belief that they pioneered the chronograph format that we have come to know today. You know, the start, stop, reset with the crown in the middle, that's all them. Something that the brand was very proud to debut in the 1930s, and well, we see what chronograph configurations are like today. Pretty good job. And of all the Breitlings that ever really caught my attention and held it, the 765 AVI, like the Longines Avigation BigEye, remained elusive. In fact, 4 years back I made a video comparing and contrasting the designs of these two watches, and I think the BigEye won overall. Some of the best experiences I've ever had in the watch hobby happens after picking up the watch. After it's been in the collection for a while, you obviously do more studying up, you do more research, and you discover these things, the origins, the background, the quirks about the watch that you may have never looked into before. And it took me reading this Fratello article for it all to make sense to me. The first complaint and criticism that the Breitling 765 gets is that it looks like a Breguet Type 20. You're not wrong. The 765 AVI has the nickname Lucy in collector circles. Why? I'm glad you asked. See, the story goes is that this watch was designed with the intention of being used by the military. Breitling wanted a military contract for their chronographs in the 1950s. So the 765 co-pilot was first produced in 1953 right next to the more complicated slide rule Navitimer. And the 765 had a GMT bezel, it was highly legible, a great wearing size, loomed minute totalizer hand with those distinctive 3-minute markers, and most importantly, a special gearing mechanism that would allow for the subdial to count 15 minutes instead of 30. We can immediately see that it has more than a few traits that links it to a particular hand heart, which by 1954 would eventually become the famed blueprint of the Type 20 chronograph. When proposals came in to submit watches for testing for the French Air Force, well, everyone jumped at the opportunity. But the agreed belief is that the 765 AVI was the first military-spec chronograph to have all of these particular attributes at the start. And if you want to get really technical, the closest Breguet to resemble the 765 AVI was a certain selection of watches created for the Centre d'Essai in Vol, the CEV, the specialized flight test center of the French Air Force. And these particular tri-compax chronographs were made between 1957 and 1959, in and around there. But Breitling, they had this design nailed in 1953. So the nickname Lucy comes from the missing link Australopithecine. This watch was very important for the development of this style of chronograph. So in there alone, just recounting the background to this piece, I have never heard watch enthusiasts talk highly about the 765 and its origins. And sure, it's not as exciting as the first watch on the moon or the first watch in space, far simpler to put on a billboard, but a military-spec chronograph watch that was a fair few years ahead of its time, losing out on being one of the most famous professional chronographs, makes for a good story. Well, the 765, where did it later go? How did it develop? It was picked up in the aviation industry. It became a highly successful watch in the commercial pilot space. But this piece would also find itself in the hands of some very interesting individuals. Like, I was watching Ford vs. Ferrari the other day, decided to do a bit of research on Ken Miles, and guess what he was wearing? In the seat of the prototype Ford GT40, he's wearing a Breitling 765. The next generation of this watch, we saw a beautiful reverse panda that also has a nickname very popular. Long and short of it is that the Breitling 765, it's a highly collectible piece in the vintage space. If you can find a good example of this 50s variant, then you're looking at quite a pricey number. In some way, I see this watch as Breitling's example of Omega's Ed White. And hear me out. From the case shape, to the profile, to the white painted hands, the painted elements on the dial, the matte dial, there are lots of parts that make up these pieces, and there are just as many differences. But just like the Ed White Speedmaster that debuted a few years ago, the level of detail that went into reproducing this particular Breitling, it's pretty unreal. So I'll share some of the best quirks. Like for this fun example, you'll see on most dials of vintage 765s, Breitling Genève on the dials, right? Yeah, that was done purely for marketing purposes, purely to push it out to an international audience, more for the American marketplace. Because when you see Geneva on a dial, you immediately think Swiss watch, right? Well, Breitling is based in Bern, which is over 100 miles away from Geneva. It's a completely different part of Switzerland. So for the Re-Edition, there is no Genève on the dial. It's pretty funny though. What blew me away most about this watch, and I truly did not expect them to do this, is the 15-minute totalizer. Now, I've been around watches long enough to know that a lot of the time it's for aesthetics. It's just for the visuals. It would look like a 15-minute counter on the right subdial, but actually count 30 minutes. And since this is a conventional B09 caliber, they would have to rework the movement. That subdial alone would require new gearing. And funny enough, the claim to fame with the Breguet Type 20 and its development was the fact that it had a 15-minute totalizer, just like this. And that it was considered an expensive exercise to recalibrate the movements to work like this. But blow me down. You will notice that the hand moves a half step every 30 seconds on that subdial. It is in fact geared to count 15 minutes instead of the conventional 30. And I know it's a small thing, inconsequential, most people wouldn't notice, but I was astounded when I found this out. And even when you look to the handset, there are 6 entirely different hands on this dial. Every single one is slightly nuanced, even on the subdials. Syringe hands for the hour and minutes, the 12-hour totalizer has a taper from big to small, and the running small seconds at the 9 has a sharp point. And of course you can't forget the well-loomed leaf-style hand at the 3. And just other small quality of life improvements, the way that the print has been applied, the way that the loom has been applied to this dial has a toothpaste feel to it, rounded. You can actually see depth to the numerals and plots and how the light bounces off them. This is what makes these classic-inspired designs so darn special, and especially when a brand pays even more attention to the finer details. The open 9s, the hook 7s, the function of the rotating GMT bezel that sounds fantastic, has a great tactility to it. The size of the watch on the wrist, 41mm, 14mm thick, 22mm lug width, has a great presence. It's just big enough to be legible, to tell the time at a glance, and just small enough to be a great daily wearer. And when I think, comparing it to the Big Eye, there are some things about that watch that I truly do miss compared to this piece. I mean, first off, sapphire crystal. This has acrylic. Not everyone's cup of tea. The fact that the Big Eye is an automatic watch, this is a manual wind. Takes some getting used to. The syringe style hands, though they're nice and they're very period correct, they do definitely represent the late 40s, early 50s. I much prefer the gladius styled hands that are on the Big Eye. And more than once I have made a mistake telling the time because I thought the hour hand was the minute hand. The high polish on the bezel and the lugs, also period correct, can get irritating at times. And as much as I do really like the symmetry and the balance across this watch, it feels a lot safer and more pleasing to the eye. I do miss the offsetting of the Big Eye arrangement on that subdial. For all the charm that this watch has and the detail that I love and appreciate, there is some character to this piece that is missing that the Big Eye has in spades. And if you really want to get pedantic, this watch I found for double the price of what I bought my Big Eye for. But saying all of that, the wearing experience, the day-to-day functionality and use is what has made this watch all the better for me. Being able to use the GMT bezel for a different time zone is good, but you can also double up and use it as a countdown timer. So having a rotating external bezel as well as a full 12-hour chronograph complication, versatility galore. How this watch can adapt and fit on so many different strap configurations. And when you break it down to its components, how it's a pilot watch, a field watch, a great chronograph, a GMT watch, I do really appreciate the fact that it is a Swiss Army knife. So why did I choose this Breitling over an Omega Speedmaster? I think, most importantly, my tastes align closer to this watch than a Speedmaster. I've said this once, I'll say it again. When I see Arabic numerals on a dial, I'm immediately drawn to it all the more. The Type 20 configuration, it's always been a favorite of mine. I mean, who doesn't dig the Breguet Type 20? But piecing all of it together, my first Breitling, an exciting journey going down this rabbit hole, discovering what the 765 represents, its background, its origin story, and appreciating how much care and detail went into this watch when they finally recreated it. The lesson to be learned in the story, I know it's cliche, but don't follow the herd. Try and discover the area, the niches that you enjoy the most, and pick out a watch that speaks to you that way. Beyond all of the history, the intention, what this watch was made for, and where it ended up, does that matter to me? Not so much. In my case, it simply boils down to the fact the design is beautiful. It's quite a unique watch for what it is, and it represents Breitling to its core. And if you've made it this far in the video, look to Breitling watches because it is amazing what you can find from the brand. Whether it's the Navitimer, the Top Time, the Premier, the Copilot, the Chronomat, and many others. So I'd like to know your thoughts on the Speedmaster, a watch that I guarantee you appreciate this oddity, and where the Pilot chronograph sort of intersects. And one final thing, if you can find one, take my advice, pick up a Longines Big Eye. It'll save you the headache. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.